Good evening. I'm Janice Mathis, Executive Director of the National Council of Negro Women. Welcome to this very special webinar this evening. We are so delighted that you could join us, and we're going to get started in just a few minutes, but we want to give you some tips and clues about how to get the most out of this GoToWebinar platform. And here to do that for us is our very able Communications Director, Mr. Kevin Johannes.
Good evening. If you are on a Mac or a computer, you will see a small menu with a orange arrow up top. If you open that up, you will see going down the side two things that we want to bring your attention to. The first one is questions. You can type in any question you like, and we'll try to get that answered near the end of the program. And below that is handouts. We have a handout of how to work GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting better, as well as a copy of the presentation in PDF format. If you have a question, there's also on your iPad or your Surface that you can actually hit the raise your hand button.
Thank you for that, Mr. Johannes. And if you have questions as we move along, you can raise your hand and Mr. Johannes will respond to that. I am very pleased and excited this evening to introduce the president of the National Council of Negro Women, somebody who really doesn't require a formal introduction, but she deserves it, and I enjoy doing it. She is Dr. Janetta Betts Cole. She is the former president of Spelman College for Women in Atlanta, the president formerly of Bennett College for Women. There are only two African-American colleges for African-American women in the United States. And it's not a coincidence that Janetta Betts Cole has presided over both of them. She was also director of the African Museum of Art for the Smithsonian. And she is a consultant. Just this week, she was advising more than 20,000 corporate executives and others about the pandemic. She brought it to our attention before it was the top of the news. And so you can't exactly be pleased because the topic is so gut-wrenching. But at least we're on top of it and we're trying to find solutions. And that's what tonight's webinar is all about. Dr. Cole.
Sister ED. Good evening, my NCNW family, my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all. This is a very special evening for me because I am here with someone that I am exceedingly close to. And I'm going to do two different introductions. That's how important you are, bro. You get not one, but two introductions. The first one comes straight from my heart. You see, Howard Ross and I have known each other for over, it must be now around 15 or so years. We often co-facilitate presentations around issues of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. In fact, the presentation that Sister ED just referred to was one that I did co-facilitate with my bro, Howard Ross. There were 22,000 people somehow feeling they had to wrestle with these two pandemics, coronavirus and this outburst of expressions of systemic racism. Howard facilitated my joining Cook Ross, a company that he founded. Howard and his wife, who I call my sis, Leslie, my hubby and I, we love to double date. And we have decided that we must be safe, not only because we value our own lives, but because there's work to be done. So we've been having some fabulous virtual dinner parties. Now, this is a person that I would want to be very near if my own life was in jeopardy. So that comes from my heart. Now, I think Howard J. Ross deserves a formal introduction. And so I'm going to do one. Howard is a lifelong advocate for social justice. He's considered to be one of the world's seminal thought leaders on identifying and addressing unconscious bias. He's the founder of a firm called Cook Ross that works with corporations, healthcare systems, higher education, not-for-profit organizations that have made a commitment. So now they got to do the work, have made a commitment to trying to create a more inclusive workplace. Well, I can tell you that Howard has the same problem that I do. He keeps saying, well, you know, I should retire, you know, I'm going to move on, you know, I'm going to do less. So after many years at Cook Ross, a company that he founded, what did my bro do? Well, he founded another company. So now he is the founding partner. He is the chief partner of a new company. Well, oh, I should tell you, Udarta is the name of that consulting firm. In 2014, Howard Ross authored a Washington Post bestseller. And this is the book until recently that he has been most identified with. The title, Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Daily Lives. But now I want to tell you about his most recent book. It is titled, Our Search for Belonging, How Our Need to Connect is Tearing Us Apart. And yes, I am going to brag. I am going to say that it was my privilege, my joy, to write the foreword to that extraordinarily timely and important book. Howard has delivered programs, presentations in 47 different countries. He's led programs at numerous institutions, colleges and universities, medical schools like at Harvard and Stanford. But I'm going to brag a little bit more. In 2007, my brother Howard J. Ross served as the Johnetta B. Cole Professor of Diversity at Bennett College for Women. He continues to serve on numerous nonprofit boards, certainly among them, the Human Rights Campaign. He's also the recipient of numerous awards for his social justice work. For example, Howard received the Leadership in Diversity Award at the World Human Resources Development Conference in Mumbai, India. Now, here is what may not be formally on his bio, but I am so proud to say that Howard Ross and his wife, Leslie Traub, are members of the National Council of Negro Women's 85th Anniversary Committee. Now, after my personal, followed by my genuine regulation official introduction of Howard, surely you can tell that I am so happy and so proud that Howard Ross, this distinguished thought leader and social activist, offered to do this webinar for us. So, bro, thank you.
Thank you so much, sis. I tell you, I could live a whole life just to have the privilege of being introduced by Janetta Cole in that way. I'm really moved. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. And Janice, thank you as well. It's really a privilege to be with you all tonight. I'm not lost on the privilege it is as a white man to be so welcomed into the space. And you know, particularly at this time, I want to just acknowledge that we just heard before we got on that it's sort of a significant occasion, which is that Nike Corporation just announced that they're making Juneteenth a company holiday. And this is hopefully a movement that will sweep across the country. As is so often, I think the challenges we have before us sometimes create solutions that take us to a new level. So hopefully that will raise people's consciousness. But just to respect our time, I want to jump right into this conversation. It's an important one, and it's a sad one, but it's an important one for us to talk about. And I want to frame the way I'm going to do this presentation because I'm going to share a lot of information with you. And we're sending the deck out so that nobody has to try to take notes, but I'm sharing all this information because I hope that it will empower a lot of you who have to deal with various different community groups to have this information to use to continue to spread knowledge about what's happening with this epidemic, or pandemic rather, because we know that it is in fact shining a light on institutional racism. And so I'm going to jump right in and start talking about this. You know, and I think it's important for us to start, you know, in the context where we're in when we look at what's going on outside, at just what we've seen recently, and that is two different movements, if you will. The first, this familiar picture from the charging of the State House, and we noticed the police standing there almost like the Queen's Guard as these folks without masks, with toting guns also, were charging the State House. And then we look and we see the difference in the response of the police to the demonstrations we're seeing on the street. So one more reminder of the differential treatment that we see in our country on a regular basis. And COVID is no different. If we look at the mortality rates where COVID is concerned, we can see this is just a sweep across the nation. We can see this gap. And you notice that Minnesota doesn't have as significant a gap where COVID is concerned, but we know Minnesota has demonstrated recently that it has its own problems. So what I want to do is I want to look at this whole issue and take a look, not just that it's happening and broadly look at it, but look at how it's such an example of how various aspects of differential treatment, of disparities shows up in the result that we're seeing in front of us. Just to give you a little bit more information, roughly 1 in 2,000 Black Americans has died, or 50.3 out of 100,000, compared to 1 in 4,300 Asian and Latino or Latinx Americans who've died, compared to only 1 in 4,700 white Americans. So you know, we could take a look at these numbers and see that the mortality rate for Black Americans is 2.4 times as high as the rate for whites, and 2.2 times as high as the rate for Asians and Latinos. Now, I want to also acknowledge that the Native American community has been savaged by this disease as well. And we also know that predominantly Black counties have accounted for more than half of all the cases and almost 60% of the deaths, that in Louisiana, specifically, Black people account for 70% of coronavirus deaths, despite making up only 32% of the population. In Chicago, where Black people are 32% of the population, 67% of the deaths. And in Georgia, Black people make up 83% of the hospital patients, even though they constitute only 1/3 of the population. Hispanics make up 23% of small business employees. And so we can look at this from that standpoint and say, you know, what does this mean? Well, it means that small business employees have been most savaged by the layoffs and the like, are heavily into that community. The 49% say that someone in their household has lost their job or suffered a reduction in pay. 34% of deaths in New York City were in that community. 20.1% of them don't have health insurance. And the Hispanic unemployment rates are increasing 25% faster than the norm, than the standard. 66% of Hispanics said they would not get paid if they had to miss 2 weeks of work. And 19 million work in essential jobs. That means 1 out of 3 food service, 1 out of 5 truck drivers, 1 out of 4 medical assistants, childcare workers, taxi drivers, and telecommunication workers. All of the people who had to go out, even in the most virulent time of this pandemic. And so we can see that, you know, already we're starting to see, and I'm gonna touch base on a couple of these other communities before I focus mostly on the Black and African American community, because we can see the pattern of racial disparity that's occurring here. Where Native Americans are concerned, as I said, healthcare has been promised, but consistently over time falls short of the need. In Arizona alone, Native American Indians and Alaska Natives represent 7% of the cases, even though they're only 4.6% of the population. Now, those numbers seem low, but when you look at them in the context of how many people there are, we can see that it's quite serious. We also know that it's affected the Asian community, that the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center have reported a dramatic rise in anti-Asian incidents, and a lot of this because of the branding as the Chinese virus. And that in New York City alone, there were 23 times as many incidents of Asian-related hate crimes or bullying as in the same period last year, 23 times as many incidents. So a couple of weeks ago, I posted on social media a note, and what I said was, this was before, just at the beginning of the time that the racial impact of this pandemic was spreading, and I posted something on social media and said, we have to stop calling this an equal opportunity disease. Because if you remember in the early days, people were saying, oh yes, this just shows us that we're all human beings, we all get affected the same, but in fact we know it's not. So I said, we have to stop calling it that. And I had a response by somebody who said something to the effect of, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, viruses aren't racist. And of course, he's right, viruses aren't racist. So the better metaphor that I like to use is that if you think of the virus as a seed, that seed could be planted in different gardens. It could be planted in a garden that's fertile, that's been watered, that has lots of sunshine, that's sort of a great environment for that to grow, or it could be thrown into a baked clay environment with no sun and very little water. And we know that that seed will grow very differently in those two gardens. And so what I want to talk with you about this evening is how the garden of racism that we have in this society, the garden of systemic racism, has been such a perfect growth medium for this seed of the coronavirus. And you know, I know that you know more than I this famous saying that when white America catches a cold, Black America gets pneumonia, and we've probably almost never had a glaring case of it as we've seen. So let's look a bit at how this system works. And I want to tell a story, and since this is the story that comes from our old friend Eric Watson, who was the Chief Diversity Officer at Food Lion, Adele Hayes America, for a long time. And Eric told me a story one time. He said, you know, they've been trying to get Food Lion stores to be more successful in some of the communities, largely lower income and communities of color. And the stores just weren't performing at the same level. And so, you know, they tried different managers, weren't performing at the same level. They started to think, well, maybe it wasn't a good market for them, or there was something wrong with the customers, or something wrong with the workers. And then he started to notice something. He said, you know, what I noticed was, I started to look at the parking lots. And I realized when I look at these parking lots that they were a lot dirtier than other parking lots, because people who live in lower income communities have older cars. Those cars tend to leak more, so they stay in the parking lot more. The parking lot then, the dirt from the parking lot gets tracked into the stores, which means there's a need for more cleaning staff and more time spent cleaning, which means that extra staff, extra money for that staff, and extra time taken from other things, like, for example, stocking the stores, making sure the shelves are ready for customers. And in addition to that, we know that in low-income neighborhoods, people tend to shop more because you want to keep some of your money in your pocket. So you don't necessarily go out and do a huge shopping run. You maybe shop 3, 4, 5 times, which means, again, more traffic to the store. And all of this leads to the store's performance. So we can see how the impact of some of these seemingly unrelated things. I mean, who would think that the kind of car you're driving would have anything to do with the store performance? But this is in fact the way we know that systems work. And so what I want to do is talk this evening about how this system works in 5 major areas that's affecting these COVID-19 results and response we're seeing: socioeconomic factors, health disparities, bias, assumptions, and structural racism, the everyday logistics of life that people have to deal with, and then of course the psychological impact of all of this. So let's first talking about the socioeconomic factors. And I want to, acknowledge that I know I'm singing to the choir here. I know most of you know most of these factors, but again, I wanted to put it together in a way that it could be useful for many of you as you go forward, and also to support the great effort that NCNW is making for COVID relief as we move forward. African Americans have on average lower income on a yearly basis, but also 1/7 of the acquired wealth of white families, which means less of a nest egg to fall back on when your job is furloughed or ended. African Americans have a lower percentage of salary versus hourly jobs, which means once again who's going to be laid off more, the salaried workers or the hourly workers? And if you're laid off and you're a salary worker, you still get your salary, or not. I don't mean laid off. I mean, if you can't go into the office, you still get your salary. But if you're an hourly worker, your salary ends right there. Roughly 1 in 6 Black and Hispanic households spends more than 50% of their income on housing, which again means less available income. Black employment is still roughly twice white unemployment. And this is one of the things when we hear the unemployment numbers, and particularly the president touting, Black unemployment is the lowest in history, that even at that point, it was still twice white unemployment. All unemployment dropped, but the differential between the two was still roughly the same. And the impact of all this is a greater incentive to get out to work. So that means I'm much more likely to push myself out the door into dangerous territory because I can't stay home and take care of my family. Less economic reserves, which leave us to again maintain a safer environment. Less access to food, medical support, even simple things like masks and gloves. So we're already starting to see how these socioeconomic factors impact people. Higher percentage of essential jobs, which leads to higher exposure and potential contamination, not only for the individual, but also for their families. It means African Americans make up almost 30% of bus drivers and delivery people, 30+% of food service workers, janitors, cashiers, and stockers, all of whom are out there being exposed, while some of us, as you were saying, Sis, have the ability to stay at home and do our work on computers. If you're somebody whose job is a food service worker, a janitor, a cashier, a stocker, you can't do that. You've got to be out and be exposed to people at a much higher level. We all know the history of health disparities, and these disparities have been tracked now for almost 70 years. And when we look at the health disparities that have been tracked in the United States, once again, what we see is that the curve is that generally people's health has been improving over those years, but the gap, especially between white and African American health, the disparities between the two, remains virtually the same as it was 70 years ago. And that means that according to U.S. Vital Statistics, and the Center for Disease Control, African Americans are 50% more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, 65% more likely diabetes, 75% have a stroke, 50% more likely to some form of cardiovascular disease, 60% more likely to suffer from childhood asthma, and twice the infant mortality rate. Now, all of these top 5 are considered to be high-risk areas where the coronavirus or COVID-19 is concerned. So again, what we can see here already is this garden, this fertile garden for the growth of this virus. Lower income, lower access to the things that can protect you, less acquired wealth, which means more of incentive to get out and be exposed to the virus, and greater comorbidities in terms of other diseases, and also significantly more cases of HIV infection. According to, just to give you sort of a focused area in this city, in my city, the Washington, D.C. area, according to a Georgetown University study, African American residents are 6 times more likely to die from diabetes-related complications, 3.5 times more likely to live below the poverty level, 3 times more likely to be obese, to smoke, to die from prostate cancer, twice as likely to die from coronary heart disease, twice as likely to die from stroke, and 1.5 times as likely to die from breast cancer. So we can see that any or all of these comorbidities make African Americans far more vulnerable to COVID-19 based on these health disparities. The Brookings Institute also identified that climate creates huge challenges in the community, that predominant Black neighborhoods are more likely to be exposed to pollutants and toxins. You know, we look at the Flint to Detroit corridor where kids and families were exposed to lead, for example, and many have developed Legionnaire's disease and other extreme health complications because of that exposure. And we can see this in so many ways and how this plays out. So for example, I want to go back to that slide for a moment. We think about something like, you know, if you're living in a low income community, again, going back to Eric's story, lower or older cars tend to produce more pollution, more city buses coming through. Generally, the older city buses tend to be in the poorer sections of the city. And where are the bus depots in most city? So again, all of this pollution makes lungs more susceptible to respiratory disease. So, you know, again, we don't think about the fact that, you know, what would an older car have to do with this? But we can see here the links, and it's so important for us to see. And I tell you, especially when I talk to predominantly white populations about this, because people are completely clueless, largely in the white community about this, that this point over here and this point over here and this point over here all leads to the deadly nature of this virus and what's going. Now, of course, a whole nother part of this, now moving to the third aspect of this, are the biases, assumptions, and structural racism that exist in our society. We know that we have historical narratives about race that have created some structural arrangements, where people live, where they work, and differential treatment that also creates a dominant and non-dominant relationship in the narrative that we have in our culture. And that's, of course, been here for 401 years, a good 250 years before the United States was even here. We had this kind of racism in our culture. Policies and practices have reinforced, 150 years. Policies and practices have reinforced this narrative. So we put voting rights, access to loans, limited access to loans in the part of the African-American community, segregation in housing that puts people contained in areas which generally are, again, not as healthy environments for people to live in, education disparities, employment disparities, and then all of this impacts people in untold ways, especially in healthcare. So we can see that this is so important. Now, sometimes when we talk about unconscious bias, people will say to me, gee, are you letting people off the hook when you call bias unconscious? Because we know that the range of bias is broad, between the most excessive, overtly racist, Klan-style violence or bias that we have, versus the person who has no bias at all, and it's sort of everything in between, or completely unconscious about the bias that we have. Because one of the things that Dr. Cole and I have found in doing the work that we do in organizations is that very few people, you know, who go to work in organizations, relatively few people wake up in the morning, wring their hands and say, how can I suppress women and people of color today? That's not how most of it happens. Most of it happens quite unconsciously. And because of these deeply embedded patterns of racial bias that we grow up in, that we see every day. The National Equity Project put this together in a way that I think is real interesting, so that we can see how unconscious bias rather supports issues of structural systems of oppression, and then the structural systems of oppression reinforce unconscious bias. So we start with these dominant narratives that we learn from our family, the society, the media, about who's good and who's bad, who's dominant, who's non-dominant, who's smart and who's not smart, who's dangerous and who's safe. All of these get coupled with the structural arrangements and the different outcomes, which prime us unconsciously and consciously to believe that certain people in non-dominant groups are inferior to people in dominant groups, and they lead us to make assumptions about people. And I know I don't have to tell you that some of these assumptions and some of these biases even get internalized. So people start to feel this way about themselves, as we saw, of course, in the famous Clark-Dahl study that was done in the late 40s, that was used in justification of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So all of these dominant narratives then have to be held in place. So we put these in place through disparities in behavior, policies, and practice that are developed for social economic reasons to consolidate and protect that power. If I've determined that a person in a particular group is more dangerous, for example, because I have a bias that has them seem more dangerous to me, then where do I put more police officers? And those police officers are trained to be tougher, because you've got to be careful around, quote, these kind of people. And so this cultural narrative about being less than justifies the mistreatment and inequality. And then, of course, we put in the structures and systems, voting rights limitations, loans limitations, redlining, for example, residential segregation, limited access to quality education resources, safety, healthcare, deficiency of jobs, and bias in hiring. All of these things then reinforce the beliefs that we already have. And of course, what does this do? It produces lower outcomes. So all of this affects the outcomes. If you can't get decent jobs, for example, you can't make as much money. If you can't make as much money, that leads to all kinds of other things resulting from these policy decisions in health, housing, employment, education, life expectancy, and the result. And this reinforces the dominant beliefs and ideology. You see, I told you that they don't perform as well as us. I told you they're not as good as us. And so we can see the cyclical nature of this, because that then reinforces the dominant narrative, and our very actions produce the result that we claim to be observing. And we were talking before we got on, one great example of this are the stop and search laws in New York City, which I'm sure almost everybody is familiar with. The justification for the stop and search laws was that, well, we can see a criminal. How do we know that the 90% of people who were stopped, and because 90% of the people who were stopped by the police during the practice of the stop and search laws in New York City were either Black or Latinx people. Only 48% of the people in the city were in those two groups. And so the justification, well, they commit more crimes. Well, if you stop twice as many people, you're going to catch more criminals. That then justifies the process. So this is so important for us to see that we're in this cyclical process that keeps being self-reinforcing. White police officers, we know, that we look at bias in policing, and just this one study from the National Bureau of Economic Research showed that white police officers were found to be 17% more likely to use their hands, 18% more likely to push African Americans into walls, 16% more likely to use handcuffs, 19% more likely to draw weapons, 18% more likely to push them into the ground, 24% more likely to point a weapon, and 25% more likely to use pepper spray or a baton. And we won't even get into horrific kinds of behavior like we've seen in that horrible film of the killing of George Floyd. So we can see that this, and what does all this lead to? Of course, mass incarceration contributes to mass incarceration. And of course, right now, one of the most dangerous places to be in the country in terms of COVID or the coronavirus is in prisons. So again, mass incarceration leads to people being pushed into prisons where they have no space for social distancing, no services available, and more people die. And so we can see all of these factors. Now, I want to talk for a moment about bias and how it shows up, because we can see it in certain ways. This is just one study. I'm going to share just a couple studies real quickly. In this particular study, law firm partners were sent a brief that was supposedly written by Thomas Meyer, a young lawyer. It intentionally had 22 spelling, grammatical, and technical analytic errors in it. And they sent this to these lawyers, but the lawyers were told alternatively that Thomas Meyer was either white or Black. The same exact brief was sent. In other words, every word on this brief was exactly the same. The only difference was what race they were told the writer of the brief was. When they were told that Thomas Meyer was white, on average, they rated it 4.1 out of 5 and found roughly 10.2 errors on average. And you can see some of the comments: has potential, good analytic skills, generally good writer, but needs to work on such and such. When they were told the exact same brief was written by Thomas Meyer, but that Thomas Meyer was Black, the rating dropped almost a full letter grade to 3.2. They found 40% more errors, needs a lot of work, average at best, can't believe he went to NYU. And Janice and I were talking about this before we started, and the first number, the 3.2 number, is striking, of course, but the second number may be even more telling. Why did they find 40% more errors? Because you find what you look for and you look for what you know. And if you trust somebody, if you assume somebody to be competent, you look less rigorously at their errors. And so this ties right back in, once again, to our stop and search model. Yeah, if I'm searching for more errors because you're Black and therefore I don't think you're as competent, then I'm going to find this errors that were there. Now we can also look at examples of bias in healthcare. This study by researchers at Harvard University and Mass General Hospital found that that doctors sent more white patients with the same presenting symptoms to get thrombolysis procedures, which are advanced cardiac procedures, than they did Black patients. So the same patient, two different patients come in with the same presenting symptoms. One patient is sent to the advanced procedure, another patient is not. We also found that there's racial bias in pain assessment and the treatment recommendations, and this false belief about the biological differences between blacks and whites, that African-American patients are consistently prescribed less pain medication for the same presenting physical problems, including pediatric patients, including young children as young as 5 years old. Now think about that for a moment. I know that many of you have experienced this. But again, we want to see the link here, because that same thing that has, well, black people don't feel pain as much, adds to this fear of especially black men or the angry black woman, because they're tougher than we are. And it's so important for us to recognize, I can say this speaking as somebody who's white, that the fear that people in the white community have of this myth of the tough black person, that of course dates all the way back to slavery. We also know that in another study that doctors were shown patients, as you can see depicted in these pictures, who would reflect on primary symptoms of cardiac care, and 40% more white men were sent to advanced treatment than either white women or men and women of color in this study. So this consistent pattern, the American Journal of Public Health in 2017 said it this way. They said negative implicit attitudes about people of color may contribute to racial ethnic disparities in health and healthcare, that we systematically reviewed evidence on implicit racial ethnic bias among healthcare professionals and on the relationships between healthcare professionals, implicit attitudes about racial ethnic groups and healthcare outcomes. Out of 15 relevant studies that were identified, in all but one of them, evidence of implicit racial and ethnic bias were found among healthcare professionals in all but one study. So this consistent patterns that's there, and I like to say when I'm speaking to groups, so if you thought you saw something in the way that doctor treated you or the way the hospital treated you, you weren't crazy. The evidence shows that in fact it was there. We also know that bias impacts basic communication. So for example, at the Wharton School, they traced 6,500 professors, the study that was done at Wharton, traced 6,500 professors from 89 disciplines at the top 259 schools in the country. They were all sent emails from researchers to pretending to be students, that names were chosen to express the ethnicity of the students. And you can see Brad Anderson versus Latoya Brown, Sonali Desai, or Mei Chin. And that white male names were 25% more likely to get a response to an email. Professors in the higher rate of school and highest salary subject areas showed the highest levels of bias. So if we think that this can be, that intelligence is a preventer of this, it's not. Now, once again, we want to put this into COVID. When somebody comes in or calls the doctor or sends a note to their doctor, who are they more likely to respond to? And how quick is that response? Critically important in a disease where we know that every day matters in terms of the treatment of this disease and in terms of the spread of this disease. And so what happens at times like this, and I want to acknowledge a colleague of mine, Ben Palmer, who's an Australian psychologist, is that what happens at times of trauma, like we're experiencing now as a society, is what Daniel Goleman, the Harvard psychologist who we attribute to be one of the founders of emotional intelligence, calls an amygdala hijacking. In other words, what happens is when we're panicked, when we're upset and afraid, the fear center of the brain takes over. The part of the brain that's more rational part, the prefrontal cortex, the part that has us be a little bit more rational, helps us calm down, almost goes on vacation, and we react from our panic. Now, everybody who's on this call has had a moment of an amygdala hijacking. Something shocked you or some emergency situation came up, and you could feel in your body what happens, the release of a chemical cocktail of adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, the stress drugs, and we go into fight or flight mode. So first thing we do is we go into that reactive mode, that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Another thing that happens is that we begin to desire control. We want to get control of the situation, and when we can't, we turn to somebody who can, a powerful, more authoritarian person. It's no accident, for example, that some of the worst dictators in the history of the world, Hitler, Mussolini, the Taliban in Afghanistan, all of these people came to power at a time when societies were in panic mode, when they were in chaos. And we also think that at those times that the circumstance is going to be permanent, pervasive, and it's going to impact me. So all of this creates psychologically even more upset, and those psychological, the behavior of people during those times gets hit. So we know that Black communities have been hit hard, and that some think that Black Americans are to blame. Many Americans have been infected with this belief that one of the causes of higher Black infection rates is that Black people didn't take the virus seriously, and that white people have lower infection and death rates because they are taking it more seriously. And of course, in the very, very early stages of the virus, the story was that this was because African Americans were told that this wasn't a Black virus, that it was only a white virus. And while there's some evidence of that happening anecdotally, the actual evidence that being studied points into the exact opposite direction. In fact, Washington Post reported during the April 10th White House coronavirus briefing, the U.S. Surgeon General said that Black communities are not helpless and ought to avoid alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. In an NPR interview, Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy said that African Americans' higher rates of underlying health conditions such as obesity and diabetes contribute to their vulnerability, and asked if these stem from systemic racism. He responded, "That's rhetoric, and it may be, but as a physician, I'm looking at science." In other words, blame the victim. But, you know, we know that it's not unusual for empathy to be reduced when people are talking about the African American community. In fact, studies in China, in the US, and in Italy have all shown that our empathetic responses, which by the way can be measured, they're produced by the premotor cortex of the brain, reduce when we're dealing with people of other races, that we have a tendency to be more empathetic towards people of our same race. No surprise in that context why it is that when a blonde white girl gets kidnapped, the entire nation mobilizes, but when an African American girl gets kidnapped, it's barely heard about. So in fact, we know that Americans are 17% more likely to attribute health outcomes to the behavior of Blacks than any other group. And so when another group has a health emergency, they're seen as the unfortunate victims of the health emergency. When African Americans or Blacks are experiencing that same thing, the assumption is they must have done something to cause it. But the interesting study is, and this is from an article that Ibram Kendi wrote in The Atlantic, that according to the survey, Black people were actually more likely than white people to be buying non-perishable foods, hand sanitizer, cleaning products, toilet paper, and bottled water, that ironically, the very people calling Black people ignorant were ignorant about Black people. So that moves us to everyday logistics. So how does everyday logistics impact this? Well, we know transportation accessibility is huge, that Blacks and African Americans are twice as likely to rely on public transportation, which again means close quarters. It means more likelihood to be exposed to people in ways that other people may not have to. That they have poor healthcare accessibility, and that means, you know, insurance. That means accessibility to local places. It means not having to you know, drag yourself and your sick relative potentially, you know, across the city, and potentially even use public transportation, which not only puts the person who's ill in danger, but in a communicable disease like coronavirus, it means you're putting other people in your community more in danger. That we talked about high levels of pollution and poor air quality, lack of healthy food options in many communities, which are food deserts, that people can't get fresh foods. They can't get necessarily access to the kinds of things that can build up the immune system, vitamins, supplements, things like this. May not have access to health insurance, which makes people more hesitant to get early treatment or early assessment, and potentially not be able to afford it. Accessibility to safe markets, places to shop, clean and well-maintained living environments. So, you know, I live in an apartment in Bethesda, Maryland, and our halls are cleaned every single day, sometimes twice a day. That's not necessarily the case where other people live. And so that means that in a virus that we know has contact impact, that sometimes can still be communicative when it's, or communicable rather, when it's on a surface. That means if it's not clean, again, more exposure, more opportunity. Lack of green spaces and open recreation facilities where you could take your children to safely play and get some of the energy out of their system, which means that they're more likely to find ways to engage with other kids in more dangerous kinds of environments, creating more physical proximity and closeness. And then of course, a lack of trust in law enforcement, which also impacts people, because I can't necessarily trust law enforcement. And I mean, actually beyond law enforcement, we might say government officials, so safety officials, health officials, police officials, all of these people who might be the people who could help us get us the information. But if my history and my life experience says those people are not there to serve you, they may not be there even to keep you healthy, then that information is not necessarily as dependable. And all of this finally leads to the psychological impact. The sense of psychological safety, so increased stress and vulnerability, which again lowers the body's immune system. We know, and we've known for years, of course, that that there is a racism tax on health in the Black community, that all of the impact of this constant stress and the release of cortisol into the body on a daily basis contributes to those disease numbers that we saw earlier: increased cardio disease, increased blood pressure disease, increased cancer, or all of these things is the direct result of the impact of racism and the stress of racism on the human body. Questionable trust in government. So can I really trust the information that's given to me, given these same people have lied to me so many times about so many things? Not to mention the fact that the government is more attentive to the concern of people in communities of wealth, in whiter communities, and therefore make sure to get that information out in more and different ways. And of course, limited access to information, less access to computer information, for example. You know, one of the things I have every day is a bulletin on my computer that comes from the CDC, from the Centers for Disease Control, an update on coronavirus so that I can see new studies. So for example, on March 8th or 9th, the CDC issued an announcement, which many of you are sure are familiar with, that only N95 masks can protect you. Only medical masks can protect you from coronavirus, because the coronavirus itself is very tiny. I think it's 0.112 microns, and that normal cloth has an opening of 0.25 microns, so it can get in. Well, 2 weeks later, they realized that that was not true. That in fact, that having a mask on decreases the chance of being exposed by at least 50%, and if two people with masks on are interacting, that the chances of them being communicable are very, very slim. But if you're not used to getting that information in a regular way, you may still be in the misinformed group that doesn't know that's happening. And we know with virus, as with most science, this is constantly evolving information. We know that there are issues of trust in the medical research that's there, dates all the way back to the Tuskegee studies, that also we've identified psychological phenomenon like learned helplessness, that people who have found their whole life that the system won't support them at some point stop trying to use the system to support them. And then of course the otherization of people and the perception of safety leading to Asian hate crimes. And of course the irony that Black men are being asked to wear masks when your life experience teaches you that being a Black man and wearing masks probably makes you a target of, if not law enforcement, certainly other people's fear. This illustrative piece by Aaron Thomas, a reporter, he said, "I thought about the errands I need to run this week, including a trip to the grocery store. I thought I could use one of my old bandanas as a mask, but then my voice of self-protection reminded me that I, as a Black man, cannot walk into a store with a bandana covering the greater part of my face if I also expect to walk out of that store. For me, the fear of being mistaken for an armed robber or assailant is greater than the fear of attracting COVID-19. You think about that last statement for a minute. That's something that I, as a white man, would never have. That's an equation I would never have to deal with. It's easy for me to put on a mask. I never have to worry that putting on a mask makes me a suspected criminal, particularly if it's a medical mask. And so all of this leads to the results that we're seeing. And I realize that's a lot of information, and I don't want you to feel like you're drinking from a fire hydrant. But I think it's so important that we recognize all of this and how it's impacting people in the community. And so we look at this in the context of systemic impact, and we can see that the privilege of not having to deal with some of the issues we're talking about is something that those of us in the white community have that folks in communities of color don't have. That we know that the whole nature of white supremacy and how it plays out, and the expectation that when you go into the doctor's going to listen to you in a different way, that the doctor's going to take seriously what your concerns are, that the doctor is going to expect that you can handle the financial obligations involved, that the doctor will make assumptions that they can give you certain information and not assume that you won't be able to understand that information and therefore give you less. All of that. That the colonizer-colonized mindset that plays out in our culture contributes to this, that my way is the right way and your way is the wrong way, that mindset that's there. We talked about learned helplessness, that of course internalized oppression and stereotype threat, that we internalize a lot of these feelings, and it leads to that how much we feel like we can manage and deal with the things in our lives. And that when it's brought up, of course, then we run into this other concept of white fragility, and that is that if you start talking, which is really what was at the heart of the reaction that I got in the Facebook that I talked about earlier, that's crazy to say it's racism, right? Because of course, we're in a society now in which people have somehow gotten the bizarre notion that being accused of being racist is worse than actually being racist. And that contributes to the dynamic as well. And all of this gets played out often in terms of micro behaviors. It may not be that somebody boldly says or declares their racism. It shows up in the subtle ways people are treated. Who waits longest in the waiting room at hospitals? Who gets the best doctors, the more seasoned doctors versus the youngest doctors? You know, who do we take the time to talk to? You know, all of these factors involved. And then lastly, cultural appropriation, cultural accommodation. So all of this leads to dynamics of power and powerlessness and possibility of resignation that affect us deeply. So it ends up being a perfect storm. All 5 of these factors are a perfect storm that results in the numbers that we've seen. So what can we do about it? The first is to encourage well-being and mindfulness practices. And that may be getting enough sleep. Sleep and immunity are very closely tied. Manage nutrition. This is so important. One of the things that they found about the coronavirus is that that the coronavirus basically feeds on fat. So you know, really focusing on nutrition at this particular time, you know, avoiding fried foods, all of the things we know are especially important during this time. And, you know, Kentucky Fried Chicken will still be out there later, right? To hydrate, to keeping the body hydrated, make sure we're drinking lots of water. To exercise. Exercise builds the immune system. It's also really important for the mental health of people to be exercising. So even if it means walking up and down the steps in an apartment building, if there's no safe place to go take a walk, or running in place, or one of the great things is there are a lot of free services available now on the internet, so free exercise programs or things like that. Practicing stress reduction also, just quieting oneself, whether it's formally meditating or just quieting oneself and settling down, also builds the immune system. Avoiding smoking and limited substance abuse, and that's not a judgment. It's not, you know, whether you want to have a drink every now and again or whatever you do in terms of that. That's not the point. The point is that those things have been found to decrease our immune system, and so this is the time when we might avoid them. Staying connected with other people, and this is so important at a time when we're sheltered in our homes, because if people are alone, loneliness has a huge impact on people's sense of self, their sense of safety, the stress level in their bodies. In fact, John Cacioppo, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, was called the doctor of loneliness, did enormous studies on this and found that loneliness contributes to rates of almost every disease. Finding ways to practice and to touch with people or pets. Obviously we're limited in terms of physical touch, but any ways to do that interpersonally as well. And also especially to allowing yourself to be vulnerable and ask for help. If you find yourself alone or you find yourself reduced, to not be afraid to reach out and ask people for help. What else can we do? To be honest and transparent about what's going on. And I mean that both personally, individually, and also societally, to make sure that we're getting the word out to people that this is happening. And thank goodness over the course of the last several weeks, we're seeing more of that. Give people an opportunity to talk about the emotional impact of what's going on. When you're talking to friends, let them complain a little bit. You know, we don't want to get stuck in wallowing in that, of course, but getting it out of our system is healthy, because again, it helps quiet the system and settle us, building the immune system. Acknowledging that this is not an equal offending disease, and this is where public health experts have to step up and to recognize that we need to be more focused in communities that are more targeted and more vulnerable. Taking into account and acknowledging the different situations that people are in, and not making blanket statements about what people should do if they don't have the resources to do them. We need to help people get those resources. And that means expanding the benefits, both formally and informally, that people have. Using technology creatively and wisely. If we're in work situations, for example, it's not healthy to let people sit for 8 hours on a screen like this, you know, to give people a chance to get up, move around a little bit. Again, reduces stress. To check in with your employees if you're an employer and regularly see how they're holding up, and to make decisions with empathy and communicate them with compassion, even when there are difficult decisions to make. Look, there are companies that have had to lay people off. They didn't have any choice, because they just didn't have any resources to pay them. But that doesn't mean it can't be handled with empathy and compassion. And then finally, to find ways to reinforce the idea that we're all in this together. so that we can look at taking our community resources and marshal them broadly. And the last one is to contribute to others. And this is so important because contributing to others has been found to have a huge impact on people's sense of well-being. That when we give to others, when we contribute to others, and I don't just mean financially, but I mean picking up the phone and calling people, sending a text and checking in with people, setting up a family Zoom call and make sure that your folks are okay, finding a way to contribute, for example, by contributing to one of the NCNW programs, and just to know that even at a time like this, we can make a difference. So, you know, it's just called out my book, Everyday Bias. I just wanted to let people know about that if you're interested. We're actually coming out with a second edition this summer, and it talks much more broadly about the dynamics that we've talked about. So if anybody would like to reach out to me, I wanted to make sure you have the information to reach out to me if you want more information, or if you have questions about this that we don't get to answer today, or if you're looking for some support in terms of resources, and if we can provide that, we'll certainly be glad to provide anything that we can. So I want to leave with, to finish with this little video, because at a time like this, it's easy to lose hope. And this is a story that comes out of one of my early teachers, a guy named Alan Watts, who was a Buddhist, a guy who was one of the first teachers of Buddhism here in the United States. And the story kind of speaks for itself.
Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who lost a horse, ran away. And all the neighbors came round that evening and said, "That's too bad." And he said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. And all the neighbors came around and said, "Why, that's great, isn't it?" And he said, "Maybe." The next day, his son was attempting to tame one of these horses and was riding it and was thrown and broke his leg. And all the neighbors came round in the evening and said, "Well, that's too bad, isn't it?" And the farmer said, "Maybe." And the next day, the conscription officers came around looking for people for the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the neighbors came round that evening and said, "Isn't that wonderful?" And he said, "Maybe." The whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity. And it is really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequences of the misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequences of good fortune.
So I thought that was a particularly kind of important way for us to end, because this is a time when we've had some bad stuff happening. And let's hope and pray that the result of this coronavirus, the result of the incident, the George Floyd incident has, I should say the George Floyd murder, has awakened America in a way that maybe it hasn't before. So that's what I got for you. Thanks, sis. I'm not hearing, Jen. Yep.
At the microphone being
We're not
muted.
hearing you.
I had muted myself. I want to thank Dr. Do you not hear me?
We do. I do.
Okay. I want to thank you, Dr. Cole, for introducing us to your bro, Howard Ross. It did feel a little bit like drinking from a fire hose as he poured out all that factual information that he is obviously so familiar with. But it was a refreshing fountain, especially because it ended on a note, on a hopeful note. I could not help but think back through some of my own experiences as a student when I felt maybe I didn't get the grade that I deserved or the job or the promotion. And you tend to internalize those feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness. So thank you for that inspiration to hope, because where there's hope, there's possibility. But I think now that our audience would like to probably ask you some questions, and I might start off with, we've got an echo. 1 or 2 questions. Explain to me, if you will, the difference between explicit and implicit bias, conscious and unconscious bias.
Sure. Well, we all know explicit bias. You know, explicit bias is, I don't like you because you're black. I don't trust you because you're black. I don't think you're as worthy as me, and therefore I'm going to treat you in a lesser way. And we see that, you know, if you listen. It's funny, I was just listening today, not funny, but ironic. I was just listening today to an interview that somebody conducted with Richard Spencer, who's the white supremacist who was the one who came up with the name of alt-right. And, you know, this is a guy who puts it right out there. You know, this should be a white country. This should be a European country. You'll be better off if you go back to Africa and we stay here. And that's his mindset. That's explicit bias, and it shows up in various aspects of our life. But in reality, what the research shows us is that's a very small percentage of the bias that people deal with on a daily basis. That most of the percent of bias that people deal with on a daily basis is not nearly as explicit as that. It's hidden from us. And I want to share with you, just to, you know, to be transparent, I want to share with you an example. Now, Dr. Cole, when she introduced me, talked about my life history. I went to my first civil rights meeting when I was 15 years old, which is now 54 years ago, and I've been in the fight ever since, right? I've probably worked on myself around this issue more than most people on the planet. You know, I've been a diversity professional for 35 years. So I want to say that to give context. You know, I'm still a white man. You know, about 8 years ago now, I was living in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. I had a convertible at the time, and I was driving my convertible down into the city, go right down 16th Street. Now, people who live in D.C. know 16th, that part of the upper Northwest is often called the Gold Coast, because it's a very high income part of the city, a much higher percentage of white folks who live there. It was a beautiful day, so I had the top down in my convertible. I pull up to a stop sign, or a stoplight, and a young African-American man walks across the street in front of me, baggy pants, baggy shirt, hat pulled on backwards. And the best way I can say it is my hand locked the door. Now, I say it that way because the top was down in my convertible. It was a completely irrational act. It provided me no additional safety. And as soon as it happened, I looked at my hand and just, where did that come from? And the young man heard the door lock. And he stopped right in the street, 10, 12 feet from me, and turned around with his hand on his hip and looked at me with a disgusted look. And I, being embarrassed and feeling shame, immediately apologized and said, yeah, that was really screwed up. And he thanked me with a particular finger of his hand and kept walking. And I sat there for long enough so that people started to honk behind me, feeling guilty and shameful because no conscious part of me would have locked that door. You know, the part of me that started doing civil rights work and was out on the streets for all that time and did the work that I do and leads would never lock that door. But some part of the training that I got being white in this society said that's dangerous. That man is dangerous because of his skin color. Now, I'm sure that everybody on this call has had a moment like that in your life where you had an instant reaction to something that you realized was just completely irrational. But even though it happens to all of us, it happens a whole lot more with black folks. And that's because of all these things we've heard. So that's implicit bias. That's not bias. If you were to ask me before I started doing this research and studies, you know, am I biased? I said, are you kidding? I marched in the civil rights movement. How many of you have heard that from white folks before? You know, but it's embedded in us. And let's tell the truth. We know it's also embedded in the community itself. We know that black folks have some of the same feelings about other black folks because it's so deeply embedded that we even believe it about people like ourselves. And so the implicit biases are far more dangerous in the long run because, of course, the overt things, you see Richard Spencer coming down the street, you know what you're dealing with. That doesn't mean that I'm not saying he should be dealt with, but at least you know what you're dealing with. But how many people who are on our call with us today have had an interaction with somebody they work with and they walk away and say, was that what I thought it was? You know, because it's not over, it's or have a nice day racism, as our friend Julianne Malveaux calls it. You know, the stuff that is done with a smile, but it's still there. And so we have to, and the reason I call my book Everyday Bias is because it's not clear which you're dealing with at times. This whole continuum is there, but it's happening every day, all the time. And one of the things that I think is so important for us to understand is when we look at, for example, at George Floyd and the death of George Floyd, how differently even well-intentioned white folks and black folks see it. Because for most white folks, we see an incident like that, and it's sort of the bad apple phenomenon. Well, this was a bad cop, and isn't it a shame this happened before to Tamir Rice or to Sandra Bland or to, you know, all the different, we could go through the whole pantheon of list of people. And we think of these as very tragic incidents, and they need to be righted. You know, these guys need to be arrested. But of course, for the lived experience of African Americans, this is an everyday, all-day experience. And we know hundreds of people who aren't George Floyd because they didn't get on camera. Maybe they didn't die. Maybe they just got beaten. Maybe they just got harassed. Maybe there was nobody around with a cell phone. And the experience of African Americans, of course, this is like a river that flows every day. And every once in a while, it bumps up to the surface and people notice it. And so that's a very different way of looking at these incidents. And I'm really heartened by the fact that a poll that I saw the other day in the Washington Post said that 69% of Americans now see systemic racism in policing as a problem. Now, just to give you a sense of context, after Ferguson, just 6 years ago, that number was only 46%. So something has shifted, and we're beginning to see now, finally, the systemic nature of this. And hopefully, if we keep our foot on the accelerator and don't stop, that hopefully we can move that into making systemic change.
Thank you for that. We're going to turn the microphone over now and see if any of our guests have questions. And while we're making sure that that's working properly, I wanted to ask one other question. You talk about the narrative.
Yes.
That there's been a narrative in this country. How do we change that narrative?
Well, I think it starts with the youngest children. And I think we actually step back and say the first way we start is by naming. We have to make sure that people understand the impact of this story for 400 years, why that story was created for economic purposes, how that story has served the development of our country, that the whole country is built on that. It's built on that. I know we're having unfortunately, we're having an echo here. I hope it's
some difficulty.
Yeah.
Some difficulty.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that's come back again. We were having it before. Yeah. So anyway, so we have to name the narrative. We have to help people understand where the narrative came from. We have to help people understand that this narrative was not accidentally developed. It was developed for a very clear purpose. And we have to start challenging aspects of that narrative with data, with information. One of the things that we know about bias is one of the best ways to undo a bias about a particular group of people is for people to be exposed to positive representatives of that group, or positive avatars, we sometimes call them, or exemplars. So things like Black History Month are still incredibly important for that reason. Now, it would be better if Black History Month wasn't, if the whole rest of the year wasn't White History Month, and if we didn't, interestingly enough, choose Black History Month to be the shortest month of the year, which, by the way, is something that when I talk to audiences about 98% of Blacks in the audience are aware of, but maybe half of whites have even thought about the fact that we chose the shortest month of the year for Black History Month. Now, I know it came from Lincoln's birthday, but still, what does that communicate? You know, of all the months we could have chosen, we chose the shortest one to celebrate this. Just one more inequity on top of it. But these kinds of things matter. Pictures on the walls matter. Pictures on the walls in our schools, what our children see, the icons that they see, all of this stuff matters because it helps real difference.
One of the things that frustrates people when Black folk get in the room and they're talking among themselves, they feel sometimes that their complaints about bias or discrimination often get characterized as something that's in your mind, and that, oh, you shouldn't be so sensitive. That's all in your mind. You're perceiving that. Talk about that just a little bit, Howard, and also about how these biases creep into systems and become institutionalized so that they become public policy, like voter suppression and opposition to the Affordable Care Act. I mean, we could name lots of examples, but
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about those factors.
Well, let me say about the first aspect, Janice, that that this is why I believe it's so important that allies speak up. Because we do, you know, when African Americans complain about bias against blacks, it sounds like, you know, well, you're making yourself a victim. People can go to that, you know, it's easy to go to that. But when everybody starts talking about it and noticing it, then it's a lot harder to do that. And that's why, you know, I mean, I have to just say that I could have chosen a lot easier career paths than to be a white guy doing diversity work. You know, the first part of my, and it's coming back, it comes at times people say, you know, you're white, you shouldn't be doing this work. But, you know, I don't care. People can have what opinion they want. I got to do what I got to do. But I think it's incredibly important that all voices speak up about these kinds of things, that we speak for each other, that you know, as a white Jewish person, I speak to the concerns of not only African Americans, but Latinx people, and even as a straight, as a heterosexual person, to the rights of LGBTQ people, and that we all do that. That we're not looking out just for ourselves, because it's when we raise the dialogue to that level, it can be there. In terms of the systemic issue, look, in the presentation I just gave you, we see it so many ways. These subtle things that play out. You know, you think of a child in school. I was doing a session recently for white allies, and I had them do a visualization at the end. And I said, I want you to imagine you've just had a baby. Some of them, of course, have had children. I said, you're holding that baby in your hands, and just allow yourself to feel the love that you feel for your child. Now imagine that child starts to play with some other kids in the neighborhood, and he has a white friend and wants the white friend to come over his house and play, but the mother doesn't feel comfortable with that friend coming over. Then he gets to the stage when he's going to go on the bus to school, and the bus driver uses that word towards him and maybe closes the door a little bit too quickly when he gets in, so, you know, bumps him in the butt. Then he goes to the teacher, who puts him in the second level reading group instead of the first level reading group, even though he's smart enough to be in that first level reading group. Or then he goes to the gym teacher, who is more harsh to him, or even the reverse, maybe takes the extra time to coach the white kids, but doesn't coach him when he's playing ball or hitting or whatever he's doing. And we could continue on and on and on. And finally, that kid is 13 years old. And there was a study done back at Yale University a number of years ago about what Marian Wright Edelman called the cradle to prison pipeline. And they found that the big difference occurs in that age 10 to 13. That up to that point, there's differentials, but it jumps dramatically at that age. And when they assessed it, they found that there's one particular thing that happens at that age that contributes more than anything else. And that is that when white kids get in trouble, they get detention. When black kids get in trouble, they get suspended. Now, what happens to a 12, 13-year-old kid who gets suspended and sent out on the streets? Likely their parents are not home because their parents are working. So they're left by themselves. Who are they going to be hanging out with? They're going to be hanging out with other kids on the street who are in trouble, who are likely older than them. And not to mention the fact that, I don't know about everybody here, but at 12 or 13, if I could get a day off of school, I was perfectly happy with that. So there's actually incentivized to be in trouble. And from that point on, the difference just goes like this. So, you know, we could talk for hours about all the little micro inequities and micro advantages that balance this out in different ways, but we could see how this entire system leads us this direction. And it's important for us to realize that, because there's no one program that's going to fix it. In fact, some of the programs we put in place, we don't study enough to recognize the impact they have. I'll give one example, and then I'll stop. I know I'm going on and on a little bit, but I get pretty passionate about this. And that is the Scared Straight program. I know most people have probably heard of the Scared Straight program. It became famous in 1967 when 60 Minutes did an issue about this program that was designed in Rahway State Prison. And they would bring in the kids. In those days, we called them juvenile delinquents. Now we call them youth offenders. They bring in these tough juvenile delinquents at the time, put them in a room with the toughest prisoners. And the prisoner's job was to scare the hell out of these kids and let them know, boy, if I get you in here, I do this to you and I do that to you. And then they showed the video, you know, on 60 Minutes, and these kids are walking out and their lips are trembling and they're saying, oh my God, I never want to go there. That's terrible. And everybody thought, oh, this is a great program. And so we replicated it in hundreds and hundreds of places all around the country and even outside of the United States. Well, a few years ago, on the 25th anniversary of that program, some researchers at the University of Virginia did a longitudinal study of all the young people who've been in that program. And you know what they found? 14% more likely to be in prison. You see, what they didn't take into account was that a lot of tough kids are really covering up fear. They're covering up a feeling of vulnerability. And the way they're covering that up is by acting tough. But then you put him with the toughest people they've ever seen. And what the mind says, if I acted like that, people would be just as scared of me as I am of him. So it was a well-intentioned program. It just happened to have exactly the opposite results that it was intended to have. And so there are lots of different examples of that. Excuse me. Lots of different examples of that kind of behavior. So we have to be really rigorous to study these things over time and to see whether they have the kind of impact we want. And all too often, understandably, because we want to solve the problem, we just throw something against the wall to see what sticks, and it doesn't work. And this happens in corporate America as well.
You mentioned a term that I've come across occasionally, but I'm not sure I know what it means. What is a stereotype threat, and how does that play out?
Stereotype threat was a term that was originally came from a guy named Claude Steele, who is a professor who's done some remarkable work. Some people know him best because of a book he wrote called Whistling Vivaldi. But Dr. Steele studied the impact of awareness of one's own culture on performance. And so, for example, he did a number of studies where he found one in particular. He studied African American students taking the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And when he gave the test to these students, half the students, he made one small change in the form that they filled out at the beginning of the test. And that is, half of them just had their name, address, and all that information. The other half had one additional block that asked them to identify themselves by race. And what he found was that when they identified themselves by race, their scores on average dropped 100 to 150 points. That just being reminded at that moment that they were Black diminished their capacity because of the internalized bias that was there. Similar study was done by another researcher at Tufts University named Nalini Ambati, who sadly died a couple of years ago. She gave, in this case, she gave Asian female students a difficult math test to take. Half of them, before they took the test, filled out a form that was designed to activate their Asian identity. The other half filled out a form that was designed to activate their gender identity. And the ones who had their Asian identity activated scored higher than the ones who had their gender identity, because of course the stereotype around Asians is that they're good at math. The stereotype around women is that they're bad at math. So we call it stereotype threat because we say that the stereotypes that we have about ourselves actually can threaten our own performance.
You talked about African Americans and others who are the victims of bias and discrimination sometimes internalize those views. I think I read about a study some years ago where people were shown pictures in rapid succession. One picture of a man with a gun, another picture of a man without a gun, and African Americans identified the man without a gun, if he was Black, as more dangerous than a white man with a gun. Is that typical of the kind of thing that happens to us?
Absolutely. In fact, in one study that was done of police officers, they showed an example. There was a screen. They have these screens which are almost live screens. They have people reaching in, and overwhelmingly officers, by the way, officers of all race, assumed on the part of a white person they were reaching for their wallet, assumed on the part of a Black person they were reaching for their gun. Now, we know the internalized effectiveness, like I said, goes back to the Clark study, but there's an interesting thing about the Clark study, which of course is attributed to Dr. Kenneth Clark. And most people probably know the study I'm talking about, where he presented dolls to children, and some of them were white and some of them were Black, and virtually all of the children chose the white dolls. And Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, later said that that study was the study that flipped the court on Brown versus Board of Education. But there's something interesting about that study, and that is the study was actually designed and mostly run by his wife, Patrice. And so here we have this famous study of race relations that's sexist in the way it's communicated. So we have to recognize intersectionality as well. It's not enough for us just to focus on race. We have to focus on race and gender and sexual orientation and sexual identity, gender identity rather, generational issues. We have to really take a broad view, and we have to be rigorous about this. Look, it's been 401 years of building this thing. It's going to take a long time to unbuild it and to build something different. And so we have to be rigorous. And this is why, as Sis said at the beginning, it's just not time to stop. Even though we tell ourselves that we should say no. Dr. Cole and I had this little mantra between the two of us, and that is that no is a complete sentence. And yet neither one of us have gotten good at it yet.
Well, we certainly want to thank you for this presentation tonight. Before we let you go, tell us if we feel that we're being treated like the other. We're being otherized, otherization. What a good strategy. We don't want to be the angry Black woman or the fearsome Black man. How do you navigate that in a way that it gives the person on the other side of the table an opportunity to learn something new and better?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it's far from me to be prescriptive towards Black people about how y'all should act, because I don't live the experience that you have, and so I don't have the arrogance to think that I should be able to tell you that.
But we trust the science.
Yeah, but having said that, I think that one of the things that we know is that there are a couple of things. First of all, find a safe and appropriate place to express that anger. That means close your bedroom door and pound a pillow or pound the bed, or find somebody who it's safe to communicate that with so you can really get it out of your system, because if not, it'll eat you up. And that's where a lot of the health issues come from, is all this suppression on a daily basis. And if that means, joining a karate club or putting a punching bag in your house where you can just lay into it or something, because that helps do that, and it helps clear the head so that anger doesn't take over the system. Then secondly, we know basic feedback skills, and that is that saying to somebody, you're a racist, is likely to cause defensiveness to come up. Even if you have an absolute right to say it, it's likely to bring defensiveness up. But if you say, can I tell you how I felt when you said that? How I felt as a person of color, how I felt as a Black person, that's much more likely that people can hear that and therefore do it. Now, if you say that to people, I say this to people all the time, if you say that to people and they say, oh, don't be so thin-skinned, then I say, go for it. At that point, go for it. But at least it's the first shot. And the thing one last thing I want to say to people, because it is such a privilege to be here. And I really, I've been incredibly blessed, teaching at Bennett and being on the board of the Human Rights Campaign and having experiences like this, to be in a situation where I am the minority. And most white folks have not had a lot of that experience. And as a result of that, I've gotten exposed to culture. When I was at Bennett, I got exposed to the culture of the school in a way that I wouldn't if it was a mixed race group, because when it's mixed race group, we tend to lean towards the dominant. We tend to lean towards white culture, right? But having said that, there are a lot of white folks out here who really want to do the right thing about race. And I can tell you that being in those private conversations, they really do. They don't know how. They don't realize how much, we don't realize necessarily how much we're contributing, but intentions are good. And I think, we've got to get away from this cancel out culture that we're in now, where somebody says one bad thing or one wrong thing, they get, that's it, that's all for you, because it doesn't give people a chance to redeem themselves. Whereas if we get feedback and say, look, I know you're well-intentioned, but let me tell you how what you did showed up, then I will take over, and from, if I get that kind of feedback, then I'll want to behave consistent with my values. I'll start to learn that behavior. When I saw that happen to me in that car with that young man, that made me more aware of that biases in me so that I can learn to manage it and mitigate it more. And so the more we can keep the lines of communication open, the more we can ally with each other, the better off we'll be.
In this very frightening and threatening time, if there's any light at the end of the tunnel, it seems that for the first time in my life, I'm seeing white folk and Black folk and Asian folk all marching together and seeming to demand something different. How do we keep that feeling going so that it's lasts long enough that we get to change some of the systemic issues like the police practices and maybe the affirmative action and the voting practices?
Well, I think what we do is we start, as we've learned in every great movement. This is what, when I was on the HRC advisory board, for example, that was when the marriage equality campaign was going on. And if you remember in the early days, there were people like the Westboro Baptist Church, these horrible people who were just condemning and so how are you going to change those people's minds? How are you going to change those people's minds? But the way people's minds changed that led to marriage equality was not by focusing on people in the ends. It was focusing on that nice old lady who felt uncomfortable with sexual orientation or with gay and lesbian people because, her pastor told her it wasn't good, but also felt sad about these stories about, women who'd been together for 30 years and couldn't be at their partner's bedside when they were dying. And so we focused on those people. We focused on those folks in the middle. We exhaust our energy sometimes focusing on people who are extremists, I'm never going to convince Richard Spencer or David Duke that Black people should be treated fairly. So what I need to do with people like that is I need to limit them. I need to make sure they can't do any harm. I need to get people's knees off the necks of people and do that. But where I focus my intention is build allyship with those people who are in the margins there, in the middle, who can be brought over. And that's how we win the race. And so it's so important that when we come out of this time of active protest, which eventually will slow down because it always does, that we not stop building that coalition. That the Black Lives Matter coalition is not just for Black people, it's for Black people and anybody who believes in equity for Black people. That when we have our ERGs, our employee resource groups in organizations, that we have them be more focused on the issue at hand. So rather than having just an African-American ERG, we have a racial equity ERG where anybody who's committed to racial equity can be there. And that doesn't mean that some of our meetings, we might not still meet separately. That's good, that's healthy. But then we come back and share what we learned. And then together we put our heads together and say, how are we gonna change those things? Because we know from looking at the history of the world that just one group taking over that's been oppressed just becomes oppression in another way, and we go back and forth and back and forth. We're only going to resolve this when we finally work together to come up with a solution.
Well, thank you for a stimulating and enlightening session. At this point, we want to thank everyone for joining us. Encourage you to visit us at ncnw.org. We do have established a COVID-19 relief fund that you can contribute to at ncnw.org, and you can join the organization and become an even more active part of this journey, this expedition toward equity. At this point, I want to turn it back over to Dr. Cole for any final comments she'd like to make. And thank you once again, Dr. Cole, for sharing your buddy and your bro with us.
Now, my bro, I don't know if I've ever said this to you before, but I'm moved to say it. My mother grew up and lived in the most horrific situation of racial discrimination. Her experiences with white people were rarely, if ever, positive. But if by chance she encountered someone like a Howard Ross, my mother had an explanation for you, bro. Are you ready?
What's that?
My mother would say, I'll tell you about Howard Ross. He's got a touch of color. It was her, you hear me, Sister Edie? Her world had so few white allies, so few individuals who would be in that struggle with her, that the only explanation became, he's really not white. He's got a touch of color. So thank you, my bro, for having a touch of color. Let me just end by saying, I join you in being hopeful. I join my sister Edie in seeing signs, small as they may be, that we haven't seen before. But hope is a necessity. It is not a plan for action. And at NCNW, we've got plans for action against all forms of systemic inequality. Good night, and we look forward to being in the struggle with you.
Good night.
Good night. All right.